Well, hello. I'm excited to kick off our next panel today. I'm Jesse Jenkins. I'm an assistant professor here at the Department of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering and the Andlinger Center for Energy and the Environment. So what is an engineer doing at a conference on industrial policy? Well, my group is the Zero Lab, which focuses on modeling large-scale transformations of energy systems, including the influence of new technologies and policies in shaping transitions in the energy sector. And so that situates our work necessarily at the intersection of technology and policy, which is the domain now of industrial policy as well. And so I've spent much of the last 4 years evaluating the impacts of federal policies or their likely impacts on the transition of our energy and industrial sectors towards new technologies and cleaner products, and thinking about evaluating the multiple goals that those policies have. So that's where I want to start my remarks here and hopefully situate this conversation, which I think occurs at a very unique moment, right? We now have several years of accumulated experience of some quite innovative and experimental policy efforts to intervene much more robustly in the economy than we have seen in US history outside of the defense sector in quite some time, right? And that includes major initiatives around semiconductors, electric vehicles and batteries, wind and solar power, and other clean energy technologies that are embedded in the CHIPS and Science Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. With several years of accumulated experience with implementation, for better or worse in different contexts, and now at a moment of really severe transition, right, in the objectives and goals of the federal government, I think it's quite useful to take stock of where we're at and what we can learn, and what academic research can do going forward to help guide the next round of policy formation. And I think if we look broadly at the transition from President Trump to Biden back to Trump, one of the major through lines, the few areas in which there is some degree of consistency between these very different administrations, is in the realm of industrial competitiveness. Different strategies, right? Different policy approaches to achieve those goals. But if there's one thing that President Biden carried over from the first Trump administration, it was a strategic focus on competitiveness in certain manufacturing sectors, right? Whether that was semiconductors or EVs or batteries, and a continuation of an effort to use tariffs and subsidies domestically to disentangle U.S. supply chains around strategic industries from China, right? A very substantial reversal in U.S. policy, decades of efforts to integrate with China and integrate China broadly in the world economy. Again, very different policy mechanisms potentially used in the second Trump administration to achieve those goals, but that continues to be a stated objective of the federal government. So I think it's an interesting area where there may be some opportunity for continuity or for revisions of current policies, but with some degree of high-level continuity in the objectives. But I think we need to be clear as academics what those objectives are, right? If industrial policy can be defined as the use of public policy to shape private sector activity towards public ends, we have to be very clear about what those public ends are, right? And that, I think, requires clear communication with policymakers, right? Understanding of what their actual stated objectives are. Integration with the political science and political economy community, right? To understand how those goals are shaped by political economy and different political objectives that guide policymakers and industry. And an effort in economics to evaluate the success or failure of those policies on their own terms. Right? So not just on matters of global efficiency, right, which is an important metric, but on the specific objectives of those policies, which are often designed towards a variety of different public ends. Be that driving economic growth through productivity gains, right? That's an area we're all pretty comfortable with, as in the economics literature. Or whether that's supply chain resilience, right? Resilience against disruptions, whether those are global conflicts or pandemics. Whether that's an effort to promote export competitiveness or domestic market substitution. Right? Two very different objectives with different signs of success and failure. Is that an effort to address environmental externalities, right? Which is a whole other set of public objectives that could drive very important interventions in the economy. So I think we need to be clear about what those objectives are, and in many cases there are multiple objectives carried out through a single policy, which makes this even more difficult to assess. So with that in mind, I'd love to open the conversation here with our panelists to look back at some of the lessons learned from the CHIPS and Science Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, and hopefully to look forward at where we might go from here in both policymaking and research. And I'll start by welcoming Joseph Majkut, Joe is an alum here of Princeton, PhD in atmospheric science, and is now an analyst at the Center for Strategic International Studies, where he thinks quite deeply about the intervention of policy to guide industry development in climate and security. So welcome him to the stage. Thanks.
I don't know that I want to be accused of thinking quite deeply. Hey, it's a real pleasure to be here. Also quite nerve-wracking. Like, you don't get over having been a second-year PhD student giving seminars in these rooms. But it's such a delight to be back. Thank you for having me and for hosting a really incredible conference. I agree, and it has now become common wisdom that industrial policy has entered the sort of forefront of policymaking. Just from my stance, I work with policymakers, work with the private sector, trying to make these things work better at CSIS. Maybe I can preface my remarks by saying I am industrial policy skeptic, but the friendly opposition for industrial policy and its application in the United States. And my comments today should be taken in that spirit. But it's clear that our political leadership is worried about the state of the labor market. They're worried about our ability to manufacture things here in the United States. We saw earlier, I think, really brilliant evidence about how the COVID supply shocks and the residual effect those had on our economic security have motivated an entire rethink about the use of industrial policy throughout the OECD and in the United States. And I think that, in my conversations with policymakers, we see a lot of desire to continue to invest and secure long-term economic advantage. More and more policymakers see long-term technology and economic advantages, particularly economic growth, as being key to the U.S.'s ability to protect its geopolitical strength, protect our national economic sovereignty. I wish we talked more about how to measure that yesterday, because we have intuitions for it, but it's really hard to grok. But it's very clear that they want to do these things. My concern, and I think I'm going to share some observations over the application of the IRA and the IIJA over the last few years, is that we don't really have the institutions capable of carrying out industrial policy at the scale that our political leadership wants, and therefore we have to infer democracy demands. And I think it's going to be really incumbent, headline for the whole talk, on the academic community, especially given the rush toward industrial policy we saw during the Biden administration, to move quickly to do rigorous studies of the practitioners of industrial policy, both on the state side and in the private sector. What worked, what didn't work, what lessons can we learn before false narratives get set up, people forget. And I think there's going to be a lot of potential value in doing that, and not being, it'll keep us busy while Elon and the crew give us a, new field on which to build. A little bit on the IRA and the IIJA. I work in the energy security and climate space, so these are very close to the work that we do at CSIS. I played some small role in trying to inform legislation that got into each of those pieces of work. And just to ground, they were big spending programs. They were doing slightly different things. The IIJA was the bipartisan infrastructure law was a bipartisan effort meant to invest in long-term innovation in areas where we know we could improve energy security, maybe get some further technology advantage, and contribute to long-term decarbonization. Hydrogen hubs, the development of direct air capture hubs, major investments in rail infrastructure, investments in EV chargers. Some of those things have worked, some of them have truly failed, and I think we need to learn from that. Meanwhile, the IRA, on a partisan basis, tried to turbocharge that entire process, mostly through the extension and plus-up of tax credits for clean energy generation, but also for manufacturing supply chains for clean energy, and some grants and loan programs, some of which were huge successes and others had real problems. I think I want to talk about just three kind of questions in the course of the next 10 minutes. What lessons can we draw from the successes and failures as I interpret them? Open to debate on that question. And how should we rate these against the objectives like Jesse describes? or we heard about last night. And I think lastly, I want to comment a little bit on, are these going to be politically durable? The last one right there is hard to fathom at this moment, given the aggressive halts to spending programs that the administration has come in with, as well as ongoing legislative efforts to eliminate much, if not all, of the Inflation Reduction Act. But it's important to think about how that broader trend can project onto different industrial policy on the color spectrum, right? Green versus brown. The IRA. So the IRA was billed as the largest investment in climate ever. I don't need to go over the details. Jesse knows them way better than me anyway. How does it do against the two principal externalities that it's trying to address? Climate and national security / economic competitiveness. My best reading of the evidence is by spending nearly $1 trillion, give or take a couple $100 billion, we would reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the United States 40% against the benchmark value in 2005 by the year 2030. This got us about halfway toward the Biden administration's goal of a 50% emissions reduction cut. Changing economics in the power sector, state and corporate policies are already driving decarbonization. So we got an 8 to 10% boost on the pace of our decarbonization over the relevant time window out of a fairly large degree of spending. And initially you go, oh my gosh, this is terrible, right? Like this is not high value for the money we got. But if we think about, we've measured sort of the cost per ton of these interventions. If we think that reasonable values of the externality associated with 1 ton of CO2 emissions are 80 to 150 to a few $100s, depending on how you set your discount rates and a whole bunch of other social factors. We were spending with the IRA somewhere between $27 and $102 per ton of CO2 reduction. In some places that was much larger. EVs are a good case. In some places that was much smaller, particularly for energy efficiency investments. That actually compares relatively favorably. It shows us, however, the scale of the challenge, because if you look at the gap between global emissions outcomes and what we need to achieve global climate targets, my rough calculations tell us we would need 20 IRAs globally to close the gap between now and 2030. And given that the U.S. is the only country with the fiscal space to do this kind of spending, and we probably are going to do less than we had originally intended, there's like no way that this is a scalable model for decarbonization. So we then need to think about it as industrial policy for building supply chains, maybe improving political economy. And in that case, I think the results we've gotten from the IRA are relatively mixed, but they are there. Between 2021 and 2024, we saw increased investment in clean energy deployment, manufacturing, and electrification throughout the country. It increased 24% in the last year alone, which is really when you think the IRA might actually be affecting financing models in a significant way, reaching $273 billion over the last year. That's numbers from the MIT Clean Investment Monitor. That spending is roughly 45% retail spending, electric vehicles, home electrification, et cetera. 35% on the industry side, that's clean power generation, wind, solar, a little bit of investment in clean hydrogen and other things. And then 20% in manufacturing, in particular batteries and solar panels. The big winner of the last few years in this context has been battery manufacturing. Together with semiconductor manufacturing, the other objective of our panel today, those two account for, I think it's like 60 or upwards of 60% of new manufacturing construction investment in the United States, which is the largest growth category that we've had over the few years. So the reindustrialization that we are currently experiencing is EV batteries and semiconductors, and then like everything else is really small. There are clear national security elements to the reshoring of that battery supply chain, insofar as we're going to be using a lot of EVs, insofar as we have lithium-ion batteries, not just in those cars, but on the grid, oftentimes in homes, or just frankly in consumer electronics. The ability to have a domesticated supply chain does respond to the economic security concerns that we hear from policymakers. The numbers there are truly staggering. There's a brilliant paper from Nadal Nasser at USGS, who studies the flows of critical minerals, lithium being one of those, into the U.S. economy. They find that a 10% supply disruption, easily conceivable in a kinetic or a large trade conflict with China, who owns 68% of that supply chain, 70%, is a like 5% GDP reduction event in the United States. Right? Now, that's one model, but that's a tremendous economic insecurity that we really do need to deal with. And the IRA, to its credit, was built to address that. You get the maximal credit value for EVs if you're using an ex-China supply chain for the battery. Since all the values in the battery, there is a lot of potential pull there, and we have started to see it in the development of the battery supply chain in the U.S. The extent to which that stuff continues, it is dependent on the robustness of that legislation. But I think on the national security side, in particular in the EV battery case, you do see the IRA addressing the national security objectives relatively robustly. A couple of success and failure cases that I have highlighted. It's too hard to go through all of them, but I think important ones. One, the IRA plussed up, gave much more funding to the DOE's Loan Programs Office. This, in my opinion, is an excellent example of an institution that can do good industrial policy. There's a few reasons why. It has a clear focus and a mandate. So the Loans Program Office is designed to target high-impact, first few of a kind scale-up projects in emerging energy technologies that address emissions, improve efficiency, or energy security. It works on categories rather than a priori selecting firms. In fact, they have a very rigorous project selection mechanism that the private sector comes to the LPO saying, we want support for this project. They work together using the expertise within the Department of Energy as well as information from the private sector to then make conditional loans along a variety of benchmarks before making a final loan investment. Most people here are probably familiar with the story. LPO has had a couple politically sensitive investments that it's made, one in Solyndra being the big one, but otherwise has yielded money back to the Treasury. And you might even imagine that it is under indexed on the risks it takes because it's been so successful in returning public dollars back to the government. The other thing I think, but I don't really care to comment on that. I think one of the things that institutionally I was really impressed with what they did, and it's why it's important to document all this quickly. Jigar Shah as the director, big personality coming out of industry, but really did smart things. They emphasized communicating with the private sector. They said, here's what we're able to do for you, but we can't want these projects more than you can, right? If we're going to rely on the private sector to make these investment decisions and carry these projects out, the government has to be an aid, it can't be a lead. They were like extremely diligent in creating conferences, marketing materials, reports about where we are in the various technology pipelines to make the opportunity available to the DOE. They weren't just saying, here, come bring us projects. It was, here's what we need to see, here's how we're going to make evaluations. And the successes that they were able to stack up do address the two, my list. Oh, no, I scrolled. Oh, my gosh. They do address the two things. I have to go from memory. They address the two things that we've been talking about, right? So, emissions reductions by big investments in novel clean energy technologies, but national security is underappreciated. They were funding lithium development projects in Nevada, both at Rhyolite Ridge and the Lithium Americas project. They invested in battery recycling for EVs so we can create circularity in that supply chain. They made significant investments in the demand response tools that we can use to balance the grid in a higher intermittency, higher renewable scenario, but now also to accommodate data center growth. There was, I think, a lot of, and they provided final financing for the Vogtle nuclear reactor. There's a lot of successful elements to point to there. The second one also comes from the DOE that I think was a real success, underappreciated, and also really cheap. So in a world where we might need to do more with less, an inspirational example, and that is I call your attention to the DOE's liftoff reports for novel technologies. Jesse knows these well. They're binned across advanced nuclear, carbon management, so carbon capture and storage, direct air capture, clean hydrogen, those technologies where we know the government through the IIJ and the IRA is already making investments and provide significant opportunity for us to reduce emissions or capture elements of the value chain going into the future. And the reports are brilliant. they provide a really important knowledge transfer mechanism because the DOE has so much internal knowledge that it has had historically a hard way of getting it back. We've always done industrial policy in the energy space. We've always done a lot of it at the DOE, but their track record for success over the last few decades is abhorrent to the amount of money that we have given them for various projects. And so now let's fix that. And the LPO gives these liftoff reports are an excellent example because what do they do? You can open one up on any of those technologies and it'll show you the whole stack of knowledge and technology we need to see these things reach scaled deployment in the US economy, which we can infer then also applies to the global economy. It'll show us the cost points where we are today and where we need to be for scaling, and it'll show you the technology pathways that the DOE assessed as possible. And now if you're an innovator at a university or a small company and you say, oh, I can actually do widget A at price point B, which meets the DOE's assessment for reaching scale up in that technology, how much easier is it to go to a financer and say, hey, I think I need investment because I can meet this exact thing? The coordinating value of those things is totally immense coordinating value. And I think if the current administration decides to not continue with the publication of those, that's a thing that needs to be done outside of government for the time being because of their value, though they would not be as good. Two places where we have failed. The Hydrogen Hubs initiative, unfortunately, has really struggled. The Hydrogen Hubs program was created under the IIJA. It's an $8 billion program to create local, regional innovation hubs for the creation of clean hydrogen. We have struggled to get those off the ground. Government was supposed to provide money to solve coordination problems. How do we get the infrastructure? How do we match suppliers and buyers in an entirely nascent industry? We wrote a series of reports on how to make those successful. We were listened to by the DOE, and we've still not seen hydrogen hubs really take off in the time since they were implemented. And now, given the political situation, they're a great risk. It's an open question as to whether or not they would have ever been successful, because the thing that happened was it's hard to find people who want to buy hydrogen at the price that it can be produced. So they were an attractive mechanism for people who want to produce hydrogen. They were an attractive mechanism for policymakers who want to see that investment in their states. And they're not an attractive mechanism for anybody who is purportedly supposed to buy this stuff. We didn't have good policy models to figure out the demand side. And that was a statement about some of that was planned to be done in the Inflation Reduction Act, and it's a statement about when we designed them at the congressional level, we just weren't really thinking about the demand stuff, and the stuff we tried to duct tape together afterward has failed to work so far. The other failure, and the one that I think is actually slightly worse, is the EV charging investments that were supposed to be made under the bipartisan infrastructure law. This should be it feels like this should be easy, right? We gave $8 billion or $8.5 billion of public money to the Department of Transportation to build EV charging stations around the country. They were supposed to build 500,000 of these things. At the close of the Biden administration, we built 11,500. Terrifically bad performance. And this is that is a tough industry. It's a place where it's hard to make money. They'll point to the sort of inability to coordinate state, local permitting issues, utility rules, with the inability to just flood the problem with money. But when you think about the sort of political reputation of industrial policy, this is a real challenge. Then when you think about the long-term goals of industrial policy, one of the best ways to increase EV uptake in the United States is to improve charging infrastructure. There's a basket of academic literature on that front, much more effective on per dollar spent than any consumer tax credit to buy a Chevy Equinox or whatever. And we just completely fell flat on our face trying to do that over the last 4 years. And those kind of mistakes should not be repeated. Okay. Lastly, the durability. The goal, the framing of the IRA as a large climate program covers up the framing of the IRA as a big industrial policy experiment, which is meant to create ex-China supply chains for strategically important technologies. As Congress is debating how it wants to spend money, whether or not the Republican leadership will try to get rid of these tax credits or otherwise reform them, it is the security argument, obviously, which will give them more longevity. were we to have more ability to emphasize that security argument and understand its contours, I think we would be in a better position to talk about this policy in the context in which our current political leadership would like to be able to talk about these policies. Not a critique of the academics who've done incredible work trying to evaluate what the effects of the IRA would be, but maybe a lesson for the future about how we should index the research that we're doing on these kinds of things. And I want to close with a reflection on what I think we can do as scholars, though I'm a part-time scholar myself. I do think it's important to get, these are my musings on successes and failures, but I think it's really important for us to look clearly-eyed with rigor at all of these things to try and understand how we can make institutional improvements. Because if it is true that there is a bipartisan consensus around industrial strategies, and we are probably great society-ish realignment or renegotiation between markets and government, we clearly don't have institution. If we can't build more than 11.5 EV chargers, we're going to domesticate the semiconductor supply chain? Come on. And the lessons you hear from folks who are working in these offices about the, I want to use a delicate term, the non-high functioning nature of some of our institutions really does need to be addressed, right? So we hire, my favorite anecdote to close, we hired a guy into the CHIPS office who's a friend of mine and I think well known by some in the community. He'd run logistics for a major electronics company. He'd help them shift their supply chains out of China and into Vietnam. This is the kind of person you want to be able to bring into government. He got there, we gave him a $200 laptop that had a 15-minute battery life and no ability to communicate with the outside world for 6 months outside of particular things. How are you supposed to do your job? You can't recreate the success that the LPO had as an example if you don't have similar abilities to say, here's what we need to see, here's what we're going to see it, and we're going to communicate with you guys frequently, often, because that's what government is here to do in terms of industrial strategy. So, call to action for all of us to really try and diagnose what happened over the last few years to make improvements for future iterations, and look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Right. I think we're going to jump to that CHIPS example right now with Franklin Keller. Franklin has decades of experience investing in and managing in the semiconductors industry, including a role implementing the CHIPS and Science Act from the belly of the beast itself. So thanks for joining us to talk about lessons from CHIPS. Thanks.
Thank you so much for having me. As somebody who had a $200 laptop that the U.S. government issued me to try to execute things like PowerPoint, which I don't really like, I put together a presentation and tried to explain what it was that we were up to for the past almost 2 years trying to actually implement the CHIPS and Science Act. So here's just some disclosures because I run a hedge fund, so this is what my lawyers made me do. So I'm probably the only not policy person here. This was something that I undertook as a gift from my prior employer, essentially. I've spent my entire career investing in and around the semiconductor and hard tech industry. Globally, the last place that I left, Citadel, I had a 15-month non-compete. And with that time, it just so happened that the CHIPS Act had passed. It's sort of a strange thing to go to your future employer and say, hey, I have 15 months to do this, but if you're open to it, I'd love to bring the experience that I've had over an entire, almost half my life now, investing in this industry as a shareholder. And I happen to know a lot about both the things that you need right now. So let's try to figure out how to make this happen. So I call it my study abroad program in DC because my family and I, we live in New York City, and I'd fly down to DC every week and try to, with a bunch of other folks, try to figure out how to implement this policy. But yeah, like I said, I was there for a year. So my last day of office was known by the first day. And then I took the weekend off and came back into public markets where I've started a hedge fund that's focused on TMT investing globally. Anyway, what did we achieve? And, it's kind of interesting because like when I look at this map, which is a bunch of, actually it's mostly now, fully signed documents that will bring, that underwrite about $500 billion worth of semiconductor manufacturing capex in the United States of America. And so like when I look at the map, actually it was kind of cool for someone like me that's been doing this my whole career, having to spend a lot of time in Asia. I think about this in terms of like my own children who are running around campus someplace. Someday they might not have to spend, a couple months each year in Asia trying to figure out this industry. It might be happening in Colorado or Ohio or other places. And so what we had was within our own office, a $39 billion program to underwrite between 5 and 15% of the total capital expenditures that were brought to our program. And as investment director within the program, we worked on teams to evaluate each of these different projects for their merit. The merit element of it, first and foremost, we were trying to solve national and economic security needs. I'll get into that later in terms of how I think we were actually effective relative to that. But the thing that really that resonates with me as somebody who's been an investor in this industry my whole life is that the semiconductor industry went from severe supply shortage during COVID, which we all got to know and love. This policy that came from Congress was a response to that. And what was funny, because like my mom never knew what I did for a living, and suddenly it's on the news every day. What was funny about it is that we encouraged all this investment at like absolutely one of the worst times to be actually building supply. So what's kind of interesting from my perspective as a shareholder, as somebody that owns parts of these companies that were doing this, no shareholders wanted this. Like when you're going through a supply and demand-led inventory correction and you don't know where the end of it is, the last thing that you want to be doing is building more capacity, particularly in America, where I'm not breaking any news, it's definitely more expensive. So what should be observed here is actually kind of an interesting achievement because it probably should not have happened. And so what were some of the hurdles that we faced in terms of implementation? When I say semiconductor customers, I mean the Apples, Googles, Facebooks, whatevers of the world. They certainly didn't want to pay any more than they necessarily had to. And there was essentially not really very much interest or support in domestic manufacturing of semiconductors. I guess in that context, as somebody that was begging these companies to try to reconsider how it is that their supply chains operated, that is a thing where I think that tariffs and the implementation of tariffs actually changed the demand picture, which puts a lot of different things into play. But it's very interesting to me that these semiconductor companies decided to do all this in the context of also their customers did not support it. Again, it's kind of an impressive achievement when you consider that the investors and the customers really were not very supportive, other than to come to DC and say like, yeah, you should do this. They weren't very supportive otherwise. Within our CHIPS program office itself, a lot of incredibly talented individuals that I got to work with there, probably one of the most talented teams of people I've ever worked with, which is incredible because most of us took significant pay reductions to go do this. And it was very interesting to me because we start with a blank sheet of paper. And one of the things that I guess is a constraint within any sort of bureaucratic organization is a fear of failure. Particularly the fear of a Solyndra type investment that goes bankrupt that's very high profile. Like it lived rent-free in everyone's minds. And so that really ended up gearing a lot of the investment infrastructure where if you were to ask me as an investor, what I find useful to make a decision. Many of the things that we produced perhaps were not. And, it's free to go investigate if you really enjoy the whole FOIA process, what our investment infrastructure actually looked like. But a lot of it was really just to respond to future inquiries from the Inspector General, Government Accountability Office, and eventually Congress. I think that created a lot of paperwork, but didn't necessarily drive the investment decision-making that we were all there to actually try to implement. The other really big one, and this is really more so with the interactions with the companies we're trying to encourage to invest in America, federal regulations were a real headache. And the real disappointment about these two in particular, so the Davis-Bacon Act, which requires a federal prevailing wage be paid in any state where you're receiving federal dollars, if you're going to take federal funds, you have to comply with this, or at least, retroactively also rep to the fact that you have paid prevailing wage. And I guess the reason why that and the National Economic Protection Act elements were particular hurdles for us is because they introduced new elements where TSMC and Intel didn't just decide to, or Micron as an example in upstate New York, they didn't just decide to build in these locations yesterday. They've been doing site studies and had actually, in some cases, broken ground and actually started to invest billions of dollars of CapEx in the United States of America before the CHIPS Act was even passed. And so retroactive compliance ended up being a big hurdle. And what's actually kind of quite interesting, in my opinion, is to how that dam actually got broken and how our largest deals actually got signed is actually Donald Trump's appearance on the Joe Rogan podcast. I can remember listening to the podcast and emailing my former boss. I was like, hey, man, I know you didn't listen to Joe Rogan podcast last night, but you should probably know that this candidate for president just spent 5 minutes of a 3-hour discussion, the last 5 minutes talking about the CHIPS Act shouldn't have been a thing and it should have been a tariff. So I left the program by this point in time. I left when my non-compete was over on the 29th of March. But I said, I don't know what you're still debating, trying to get these deals signed before this next incoming administration comes along. But it probably has something to do with this. You should probably tell these companies that would you like a tariff and a subsidy or just a tariff? And, this is all public information. You can see that these large deals, there are a whole parade of them signed right before the end of the last administration. And then some other elements that were impediments were actually intragovernmental issues. And I would say that a solution to some of this would have been a more energetic executive office that would have better coordinated the activities of all the things within the purview. We can debate the merits of export controls, but obviously when we're trying to encourage a company like NVIDIA or AMD or whatever to buy more, American semiconductor manufacturing, but at the same time, we're taking billions of dollars out of their revenue lines because there are different foreign entities of concern into which they can no longer sell. There's very little coordination between some of those activities and our own activities. There is also an element that's probably an interesting area of study. I know Kyle spent a lot of time looking at this particular issue, but export controls created a de facto monopoly at the leading edge. The leading edge, because these things are so expensive, absorbed a lot of our capacity as CHIPS program office, the dollars that we had to spend. So the Chinese can't compete at the leading edge. There's no real competition for these leading edge providers. And so at the current mature process node is the only area where the Chinese are unconstrained to go invest. And in the United States, we really weren't able to find that many projects at the current mature process node. The only ones that were really large and meaningful, one's Global Foundries, the other's Texas Instruments, the other's Microchip. It's really difficult to justify some of those investments. So there's no protections for the only outlet. Like the Chinese just ended up spending the same amount of CapEx but instead of dividing it amongst the leading edge and current mature process nodes, could only spend it in an area where we're particularly vulnerable because we have no export controls to actually prevent the Chinese dumping their lagging edge semiconductors into the United States market at some point in time. And then the other, a lack of coordination with the Department of Defense was particularly disappointing. I can't talk a lot about particulars what occurred, but there's a Bloomberg link on this slide deck that discusses some of the elements of Secure Enclave, which are top secret, special compartmentalized information projects that were at the behest of the DoD. They were meant to be contributing $2.5 billion to those projects that are specifically for national and economic security. And at the 11th hour in late February, decided that they were not going to do that. You can do the math. We had $39 billion, of which $2.5 billion disappeared. That was very disruptive. And furthermore, the DoD was not very helpful in terms of ever identifying projects for us to ever invest in. So that was disappointing. This is fraught because I'm trying to project what history might be in 2025 by the end of the decade. But I think that what was such a privilege about this role was that I really love this industry, and I think it's amazing and it's critical to society and how we operate. And so it's a real privilege to get to try to implement policy set forth by Congress to that end. And what I tried to remind our colleagues of all the time was that I don't know how this is going to work out. But what I feel really confident in is that by 2030, this revenue picture for semiconductors will be at least $1 trillion annually. And we should be trying to get our fair share of that type of supply that is likely to come in service of an incremental $400 billion worth of revenue that represents. And, the secretary eventually felt comfortable saying that out loud, where by the end of the decade, she announced last February, she believes that we should be able to provide 20% or have 20% market share of leading edge semiconductor manufacturing in the United States of America. And I'll tell you, that's not going to look how you thought it was. Is it going to be Intel, TSMC, Samsung, Micron in the neat little pictures that we drew up? Definitely not. But the demand is there. And I think that what's kind of interesting is that in the absence of some of the things that made our job actually very difficult, such as some of the federal regulations around Davis-Bacon, NEPA, some more centralized coordination of activity amongst intergovernment agencies, I actually think that there's a lot of demand to actually execute this, despite the fact that the customers didn't necessarily ask for it. I do think that the tariff picture changes that a little bit in terms of what customers are willing to stomach as it relates to underwriting semiconductor manufacturing in the United States going forward. But anyway, that's what I had to say. Like I said, it was a real privilege to get to try to implement policy. And now on the other side, kind of see what's going on as an investor in this industry and try to support and be a steward of the work that we did in the CHIPS Program Office going forward. So thank you.
Thanks, Frank. Next, we have John Paul Helveston, or JP. He was assistant professor at George Washington University and studies relationships between the United States and China as it relates to electric vehicles and technology adoption. And so perfect person to dive into analysis of the sort of goals and success or failure of the Inflation Reduction Act and infrastructure laws, interventions on electric vehicles and batteries. Thanks.
All right, let's see if we can get this up. I don't use Microsoft products. I don't know if this works. I'm an open source fanatic. Everything I do is open. Even my slides, it's just a website, so you can go to this site and see it if you want. Yeah, this was made using R, the programming language. Yes, you can make anything with programming languages. Okay, so thanks for the invitation. This is great. I'm like wrapping this up. I feel like it's kind of a pressure moment. I like Jesse said, I've mostly studied China. A lot of my background my dissertation work was studying China's EV industry like before it was a thing. It was just kind of like nascent and growing, but I was kind of looking around going, oh God, it's going to happen. Like this is going to be crazy. They're doing everything here. And then Inflation Reduction Act, happened, and I have thoughts about it. So we're going to talk about it. So whenever you see a chart about China, you're going to see lots of red bars. Like that's just what everything looks like now. So red is China, if you didn't know, and
or Republicans.
Or maybe. Usually, you don't see positive growth though in that case. Anyway, but the thing I also try to look at is like these other bars. I mean, they're kind of flat. Like if you flip this around, there's not a lot of growth in other areas, partially because China's been dominating it, but also because there's been like lack of investment in other areas. So, but the timescales are important. This one is only going back to 2023, but the solar one really is like going back to 2010. I mean, this is long-term investments. But they also control the supply chains, right? This is what a lot of people are concerned about is when you look at EV supply chains, like every step of the process, except for maybe upstream mining, again, red bars, it's all China, same in solar. So, wafers, module cells, polysilicon. And it's been there going back to 2010. So what do we do about this? So I think this has been like a large bipartisan goal in DC for a while. Like you can actually trace this back to Obama. Putting tariffs on Chinese solar panels. So we have to counter China's lead in clean energy tech. So tariffs were like a big decision that has been pretty consistent across multiple administrations. Keep Chinese clean tech out of the U.S. market, right? To try to either protect our own suppliers and build up our own supply chains here. But a second one that I'm more concerned about is. Which was a lot of IRA, was kind of also keep Chinese firms out of clean tech supply chains entirely. And there's other motivations for this. Some of this is national security, which I debate a lot. I think that depends a lot by which sector we're talking about. So I think some of those are overblown. But things like the IRA restrictions on EV subsidies. You're not going to get the full subsidy for your EV if it involved a Chinese battery or even materials for those batteries. And there's also these, FEOC concerns, which themselves are kind of difficult to work with because they're not always clear. Like, what are the guidelines? If a Chinese company wants to invest in America and comply with all these other regulations, well, what do they have to do to not be a FEOC? It sometimes seems kind of arbitrary. So these are challenges. And traditionally, when you're behind in a technology, which we are in a lot of these, you put up tariffs so that you incentivize the best ones to come here. Yeah. That's usually what people do everywhere. And this is kind of going against that. Like we're putting up the tariffs, but we're also not allowing us to work with them. So this is, I think, the big challenge that I'd like to push back on and like to see some change. I don't know how politically feasible it is, but we'll talk about it. And then there's this other piece of IRA, which was about manufacturing. This was like a major strategy of the whole thing was manufacturing jobs are the jobs that we lost to China. And so, we need to both counter China, but also invest in manufacturing. And a lot of that support is going to go to Republican-held states. Where, we're going to have this enduring support for local jobs, economic benefits. And that's like a compelling narrative. There's risk to this, though, too. Because what if it doesn't work? What if those plants go under? What if they're not competitive? Then we have like Solyndra times 1,000. So there are risks. And so this was kind of a challenge for me, like a constant question is like, to what extent are these counter-China policies helping or harming this other goal of manufacturing? Are we doing this in the right way? Are we going so far and being sort of against and countering China that we're also inhibiting our own manufacturing success? So I'm going to talk about solar and EVs. Solar is a little bit different. I have stronger feelings about this one. So these are some numbers that are pretty recent. I got these from NREL, but also a great report, a white paper by Michael Davidson. You should go read. Everything he writes is great. You should read everything he writes. But total available subsidies are about 16 cents a watt, and the average module price early last year was 33 cents a watt. So that's including that incentive. All right, that's where U.S. solar PV manufacturing is at. Cost of production in China is 10 cents a watt. Okay, so those numbers should concern you. Like we could literally just take the subsidy and just buy panels from China, import them here, give them to people for free, and it's cheaper. That's concerning. And with those subsidies, we're at a 200% markup, so 33 cents still. So there's risks. Are we going to be globally competitive? I mean, is anyone going to buy a solar panel made in the United States except for a U.S. developer who has to buy it? That sounds like something that like a state-owned enterprise in a developing country might do. Like you have to buy from this government-owned entity, not. This seems very inefficient. All right, so I question this move. Now this is current situation. Maybe it gets better. Maybe you can move down this learning curve. But keep in mind that solar is a very high-pace field. This is a field that's dominated by private Chinese companies who are cutthroat competitive. Margins are extremely thin. So if you want to be close to the frontier, you kind of need to be on the shop floor in some of those facilities and seeing what they're doing. And one of the reasons we have so much like low prices is because we have way too much capacity. And one of the reasons we have too much capacity is because it keeps changing. They build a plant and 6 months later, that plant is outdated. All right, so I'm really concerned about the life cycle of solar. So solar to me is like a higher risk area that I'm pretty concerned about. And we may not also get a lot of the benefits that we want. Like we wanted jobs, right? Manufacturing is only 12% of the jobs in solar. Most of it is downstream. 2/3 of it is in deployment. And so we actually might have net solar job loss, where if the costs are too high, the projects don't pass, the development doesn't happen, and you lose jobs on that side. I'm someone who cares a lot about climate. Like a lot of my work is motivated by decarbonization. So to me, this seems like a very inefficient way to decarbonize our power sector. When we've got really low cost panels, why not buy them and deploy them? Okay, I will acknowledge we do need diversification. Okay, so the concentration in China is worrisome. There's been a report recently that China has enough capacity to meet annual global demand through 2032. That's a lot of capacity. Why would you want to build more capacity if that's the case? But yes, it is concentrated in one place. So there are risks there. But I don't think the energy security risks are really the ones I'm concerned about, right? If China blockaded shipping panels to the United States, every panel that's here already is still making power. You're not at risk. If we lose an oil pipeline, we're immediately at risk within hours. Okay, so fossil fuels is a much more risky energy security business to be in, and maintaining trade with China on solar PV I don't see as risky. Okay, so do we need onshoring is my question. Do we really have to make everything here? Maybe we can make pieces of this here. We actually do make parts of this here, like aluminum racking and things for mounting these things, control systems for tracking the sun. I mean, there's actually quite a lot of stuff going on here. And an alternative to the way we've used our tax dollars for manufacturing here in solar might be to focus on some of these other problems. Like the majority of the cost problem today is soft costs. It's financing these things, getting all of the red tape out of the process of permitting and trying to get, especially for large scale like utility scale solar, like getting that streamlined so these projects can happen quickly. I think we could have used tax dollars to maybe focus on that, maybe create agencies that do some coordination, like we just heard about. Like there's been coordination problems in chips. I'm sure there's also coordination problems in utilities. Anybody who works in utilities know this. So maybe there was something else we could have done. Okay, that was my take on solar. I'm skeptical of it. Electric vehicles is very different. Electric vehicles, we do have something to lose here. Like the automotive industry is massive in the United States, North America, really. It's very, very important. We cannot lose that whole sector. However, that said, the world is going electric, okay? And Ilaria highlighted a lot of these. She had like so many great charts yesterday. I saw it. I was on the train coming here watching it. It was wonderful. But this is my favorite one of just showing the transition that's happening in China. I mean, look at the scale of this. This is millions of cars, right? So the top is 30 million. That red bar at the end is 10 million EVs sold last year, most of which were Chinese companies. That's staggering. But look at the gray bars. It's been a 7-year decline in gas cars. Most of those gray bars are international companies. This is like GM and Volkswagen and Nissan, all the major players They are losing the China market. This was their growth engine for the last 20 years, and they are quickly losing it. And if they don't have an EV product to compete in, they will be out of China's market entirely. And also, the rest of the world is getting access to these wonderful, cheap EVs from China. So what products are we going to sell to them? There's a real risk that our automakers might become just like a North American only market, that we're not going to be competitive outside of North America if we don't start making competitive EVs. So we have to go there, whether we want to or not. I'm going to be a big proponent of it from a climate perspective, but also just if you want to have U.S. playing a role in the global automotive industry, we need to go electric. It is happening here, though. I mean, the hockey stick curve, this is the United States. I mean, after 2020, it goes up. But we're only at 10%, so smaller scale. So we're still at a really early stage. I think we're going to start seeing a lot of that big growth coming soon. We do have a lot of these battery plants coming online soon. So there's projects happening. So just wait, it's coming. But we do have an affordability problem. This one's kind of a complicated chart. It's from IEA, but I really like it. So what they did was they looked at the sales weighted average price of gas cars and electrics, and the y-axis is a percentage markup, right? So if you're above zero, it means you're paying a premium for an EV. The blue ones are the United States. We're at the top of all of these, right? Other countries. So our EVs cost us a lot more. It's about 75% more than a gas car here. The red is China. They're the only ones that have dipped below zero. Look what happened in small cars in 4 years. 2018 to 2022, they went from a 75% markup to like below 35% or something. It's astounding. Now it's cheaper to buy a small EV than a small gas car in China, unsubsidized. Right? So yeah, they are achieving much lower costs than we are, and the affordability problem I think is a real issue in the United States. You're not going to transition to a fleet of EVs if there's just way more cheap gas cars available. And so the bigger market is the used market. This is a chart from some work we've done looking at used cars. Whenever someone talks about EVs, you should demand that they separate Tesla because it skews all the numbers. So the blue is Tesla. That's used car prices, average price, transaction price. The green and the gray are the non-Tesla EVs versus the gray is the gas cars. So they're actually pretty close. Like you can get a used EV for close to parity with a used gas car. That's good news. There's just not a lot of them. There's very few because the used market takes a while to grow. But the bigger problem is that we're facing an affordability problem like across the board. The red line is COVID, and post-COVID, the prices used to be around $15,000 on average. Now they're close to $20,000. That's already inflation-adjusted dollars, right? So that's a big increase in prices that people are paying. This only goes to 2022, but it's getting worse. So Americans are paying more and more for their cars. That makes an EV a harder sell. Okay, and the other thing I want to highlight, which I think is also important, is that they're not all available to everyone. This is a kind of complicated figure that we've created looking at dealers all across the country. I love data. But what this is showing is the additional travel time it takes for you to get to the closest EV. So this is data from like 60,000 dealerships. We kind of know where all the cars are. And the black spots are places where it's like 60 to 80 minutes. That's basically a desert. Like there's no EVs for sale in that entire region. That's problematic. So we're only getting it on like the coastal areas around big cities, but rural parts of the country don't even have an EV for sale. You might think, there's no demand there, but maybe there is. We have no clue because you can't buy one. Like it's not for sale. Now it's gotten probably better. That was 2021. I don't have any more recent data. We're trying to get it. But there are regional differences here. And so we need more EVs here, and we need more affordable EVs. So things that don't help affordability, 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs. This does not make an EV cheaper in America. This makes them more expensive. Tariffs increase prices, contrary to what a lot of people believe in our current regime. They do, and I'm particularly concerned about the low end of the Chinese EV market. There are EVs over there there are dozens of them that are under $20,000. That would be an amazing thing for the US market. You would be able to actually get lots of other Americans into an EV, and they would experience it and see that this car can work for you. There's tons of research on this, my own work included, that shows when you get in an EV and you drive it, even just a 5-minute test drive, it can really change people's minds. They might actually consider buying it. There's a huge lack of knowledge and experience with EVs in this country. Getting access to one that's affordable that you can actually consider buying might actually, start picking up sales. And I want to emphasize that, okay, if you're concerned about competing with US EVs, like all the other ones that we make, if we bring in these Chinese ones, isn't that going to hurt us? I think it's the complete opposite, right? The competitor for like a $15,000 EV is not a Ford Mach-E, okay? The competitor is like a used Corolla, all right? So it's the gas cars that are going to get, they're going to lose sales if that happened, right? So bringing in some cheap, affordable EVs from China Carving out an exception for saying we're going to lower the tariff if your car is below a certain price threshold. Maybe if it's in the name of equity, which you can't use that word anymore, but I would love to. Maybe it's in the name of just accessibility and affordability, making it easier and less expensive for Americans to get around. Because right now we pay a very big premium to drive a car and pay for gas. You could motivate that however you wanted, but you could say in the name of getting affordable EVs in this country, we can make some exceptions. It would also put some competition, some pressure on our automakers to get their costs down. But I think a low-cost EV would be a gateway. Like you get into one of those and then you say, you know what, I'm going to go get that Mach-E next time, right, when I get a pay raise or something. Okay, effectively banning the use of suppliers. This is something that I have mixed feelings about. We've more or less said you can't really use raw materials. There are legitimate reasons for that. That does make it harder to get started. In the long run, maybe this plays out, right? I would have liked to see like maybe a bigger runway. Like, you can build a plant for the next 5 years, but by 2028 or something, you have to be using someone else's materials. I also think there's opportunities here to work with partners around the world, like go to Chile and say, all right, instead of just being a lithium miner, let's also bring you up to speed and start doing refining here. That's a win-win for everybody. There's things we can be doing outside of America that would really be helpful. And inflation is the thing that we're constantly fighting, which is going to get worse if we keep tariffs. If anybody is unaware about the 25% tariff on Canada and Mexico, that would crush our North American auto industry. I mean, it would completely crush it. It would be so devastating. I can't emphasize enough how bad that would be. So that's problematic. What can we do? I'd like to see more Chinese FDI into America. We have examples of this. Goshen Batteries, it's a privately owned battery company in China. They have a big investment in Illinois and Michigan. They're still fighting these challenges around, are we a foreign entity of concern? It's a private company, but it comes from China. Can we make exceptions for this in the name of like accelerating our own industry, right? Can we get around these things? Can we do technology licensing agreements? Some of the best battery chemistries in the world are made by Chinese companies, CATL being the leading one. And the Ford-CATL agreement, I think, could be a huge improvement. But now CATL's been put on this list by the DoD as a Chinese military company. We have to figure out how to navigate these issues. Like, we have to start looking at some of these as critical to our own supply chain and actually critical for our security to make sure that these investments go forward. If they don't, again, we risk losing out on our presence around the world. We risk not going to electric and becoming just a gas car maker for North America. So there are security risks on the other side that I think people don't talk about. This is my last thought. I like to leave most of my talks on our biggest competitor to an EV, in my opinion, is not a Chinese EV, it's gas cars. Okay? Yes, you're maybe competing some with Chinese EVs. But once you get people into an EV, the thing that they're really competing with is the affordable gas car, which we have dozens of them here. I mean, millions of them here. And it's really hard to convince people to buy an EV. It's a risk. It's a technology you may not know about, and you're just going to go back and get that Toyota Corolla that you bought for 10 grand last year, right? That's the thing that is a long-term competitive challenge. And again, if we don't go there, others are. So okay, those are my thoughts. Thanks. Food for thought here. Oh, we should turn these on. Yeah. Try to avoid feedback. Let's see.
Yeah.
Let's see if it works.
Just switch it on and off.
There we go. All right. I want to start by asking each of you to reflect on the different tools that we're seeing employed for industrial policy. I think under the Biden administration and Democratic Congress, the major emphasis is on subsidies. Not exclusively, right? There were tariffs imposed by the Biden administration on Chinese EV imports, on battery imports, a resumption of temporarily suspended tariffs on solar PV modules from Southeast Asia, for an effort to prevent Chinese firms from avoiding tariffs by locating in those countries. But those were targeted primarily towards strategic industries, not broad-based tariffs. And the approach was largely to try to lower cost premiums for adoption in the United States through the use of subsidy. Maybe quite expensive fiscally, but a potential way to resolve the conflicts that I think both Joe and JP are mentioning between deployment for decarbonization and these sort of domestic security or competitiveness goals. We did some analysis in my group to show that the combination of the 45X manufacturing subsidy and the 10% bonus that you get for deploying solar PV that uses domestic content is enough to actually make a project that uses 100% solar solar manufacturing from the US, even at the 33 cents a watt premium, cheaper than using imported panels. And that's because the modules are a small fraction of the overall cost of the project, so that 10% is a large chunk when you compare it to the manufacturing premium. So again, expensive, but maybe a way to avoid that tension temporarily. Same thing with solar PV, with EV adoption, where again, we're lowering costs. Now we seem to be shifting into an administration that's quite friendly towards tariffs. And may continue them in certain sectors like this while potentially suspending subsidies. And I wanted to hear each of you sort of reflect on the potential impacts that has, areas where it may actually facilitate industrial policy goals, including competitiveness in these sectors, and areas where it may be counterproductive more broadly. So maybe, JP, I want to start with you because you mentioned at the end there and the potential impacts of inflation, but we'll go down there.
Is this on? I don't know. It says it's on. Doesn't seem to be on. Can I just talk loud?
Yeah, we're all professors. We can manage.
We don't scream over our kids looking at their phones.
Right.
So that maybe the best point here to start off is that we should think about industries separately. Like, I don't think there's one policy for every industry. I think if you're thinking batteries, we should do the same policy for solar. Like, no, let's bring in experts and talk about where are we positioned now? Where are our firms right now? Where are our choke points? What specific policies should we use to, help that? I think it's a really important and fair point to note that, the scary numbers I put up about solar manufacturing being too expensive here. When you look at the total cost of the project of putting a solar plant together, it's a smaller portion of the problem. So maybe it's tolerable to have more expensive panels here, as long as we're making them here. But it doesn't help the problem about export though. Like, no one else is gonna buy these things. So that's still an issue. Our long-term success in being a sustainable solar industry that goes off on its own without government support and becomes competitive and starts to innovate at the frontier, I think that's a lot more skeptical that that's going to happen. So sort of short-term versus long-term, like that's my thinking on solar. I'm not sure if it's worth it. But yeah, I think we should take targeted policies. If we're going to use tariffs, we should think about what do they impact and what countering policies should we also implement so that those tariffs are not just sort of increasing costs for everyone and doing nothing else. Like, if we're going to put on tariffs, then what are we doing to incentivize FDI, or at least incentivize the best technology to come here through a licensing agreement maybe, instead of banning both? I think we need more coordination across this. And this is something where this is like state capacity issues. Like, there aren't enough people who know enough about each of one of these sectors to maybe you might need like a battery czar and like a solar czar, like somebody who's really in the industry, knows what's going on globally, and can give recommendations for that sector. And then who and where in the government does that person exist to coordinate some of this stuff like that? There's coordination challenges, which is like very echoes what he was talking about with chips, but those are some thoughts.
Joe or Frank, do you want to jump in?
Oh, go ahead, Frank.
Oh, sure. I don't know if I'm doubly mic'd here. I'll just shut this off. Yeah, I should probably clarify how I actually feel about tariffs, which is that I don't think that paying 100% more for something is good, but I do feel as though actually the threat of tariffs has been quite effective. As we were all just sitting here, 2 minutes ago, Apple announces that they're going to be building manufacturing facilities in the United States to make what? Who knows? But, they have been, chased by tariffs out of China, into India, parts of Vietnam, other elements. We could debate as to whether or not that's truly a productive use of time. But if part of the goal was to encourage companies to have more diversity in their supply chain, there is some evidence that it does work, provided that you don't actually have to ever pay that tariff. And so, I think that when I reflect on the tools that I wish that we had, because we did not have the benefit of the rest of the IRA in the CHIPS program office, which matched the demand element of the supply problem. And it's kind of crazy because, like, the example of Apple or Google, Facebook, any of these businesses are some of the wealthiest companies on the planet. They certainly have, in 15 minutes of free cash flow that Apple will generate this quarter, they will be able to stand up these facilities that are marginally less profitable for them than they were in China and India. In that context, we provided to every executive of every large TMT or tech company you can think of, as close to classified briefings that we could that, forecasted what the intelligence community believes, which is that by 2027, Taiwan is no longer a country. What do you want to do about that? And the answer was nothing. So, I have a lot of reflections on that specifically, the different realizations that I went through and the stages of grief as it relates to trying to implement policy in that context. But I think that it's an economics problem. Like, we were given a supply thing with nothing on the demand side. So I'll leave my comments there and let someone else speak.
Let me just reflect on it. I think that's really, it aligns with Joe's comments about, I think this works for me, but.
Yeah, I'm on too.
Yeah, okay. It aligns well with your comments about the hydrogen programs as well, where we have a very robust production subsidy for hydrogen. Much of the hub's funding, which could have been used more on the demand side, was actually also just to further subsidize supply, with a small chunk, $1 billion of the $8 billion, set aside to potentially implement demand-side policy, but then the clock ran out, and I'm not sure that money will ever flow. There's a similar debate happening right now, I think, in Congress, or at least deliberation going on around electric vehicle policy and battery subsidies. Right? We have the 45X manufacturing production subsidy, which is, I think, a major driver of the fact that we're seeing this huge boom in battery manufacturing in the U.S. because the demand pull side in the 30D tax credit for personal clean vehicles specifies production in North America, or in the case of battery materials, in free trade agreement countries as well. So there's no reason why those battery plants have to be in the U.S., except for the addition of the subsidy in 45X. When you combine those two, it's a no-brainer to set up shop in the U.S. instead of Mexico or Canada or FTA countries, even when you're talking about processing of minerals, which are also subsidized at 10% by the 45X subsidy. So I think in many congressional Republican offices right now, they're debating sort of how do we come up with pay-fors for some of the tax extensions that they want to implement, and obviously IRA policies are on that list of possible considerations. And what I've seen is a lot of belief that just having the 45X subsidy on the supply side is sufficient to keep the money flowing, keep these plants alive in these districts. I question that, right? Without the demand pull that you're seeing from 30D, and without the subsidy that is lowering the cost of adoption, which is then juicing the market demand, much of that capacity is going to be overcapacity and idle, and I'm trying to put some numbers on that right now. So here's an example of where we really do need to think broadly about the range of policies. And while tariffs could also be a demand pull, they of course raise costs, not lower them, and that's going to kill demand. So again, lots of different influence of these instruments. Do you want to jump in on this? Or, yeah, tariffs.
Lastly, tariffs have long-term political economy problems. It's easy in an academic setting to say, okay, we're going to set up a temporary tariff. It will decline with time. That will force competitive investments or innovation. And then, 3 years into that project, it's like, oh, we're not going to be able to do that. And then they, you revert to protectionism as opposed to market shaping. And so, the use, tariffs, I like the threat of them is better than their practice.
Yeah, sure.
Right.
Yeah, and it's true. The same political economy problems come to bear for subsidies as well. So we have to be very careful about that. I mean, I do think this raises this sort of objectives question that I raised at the beginning, right? And I think you've sort of teed this up, JP, with the discussion about solar and about direct investment from Chinese firms in the U.S. So if you take a look at these industries, is the goal developing a robust domestic supply chain that's resilient to global disruption? Is the goal strategic competitiveness from a security perspective with China, right? Because we're worried about future conflict, or is the goal an effort to build a competitive domestic industry that can compete globally? right? And those are three very different objectives that have very different potential outcomes. And I think, there's a strong case that you've made, and I agree with, that we need to have a globally competitive automotive sector. I think you can make the same case that we need to have a globally competitive battery sector, because batteries are a general purpose technology that are going to be in everything. They already are, right? From military technology to consumer electronics to transportation, et cetera. And yet, it seems like the way we've implemented those policies is actually much more focused on the strategic competition and the effort to blockade China from the supply chain. And so there's these tensions here. And I think on solar, you've argued, yes, it's not as important from a resilience perspective as, say, disruptions to oil. But I would say that solar PV is the fastest growing source of electricity in the United States. Demand is now going to grow rapidly going forward. We need to add new supply to the grid. And if we were to see a blockade of solar panels or disruption in solar panel imports, while it wouldn't affect what's already on the grid, it would affect our ability to meet that demand growth. So maybe there's a resilience argument there, but it's not one where we're going to be globally competitive. So anyway, some thoughts on my side. I'm curious your reactions on those different goals.
Can I add something to that?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So you had this chart that shows manufacturing jobs are a very small slice of the solar value chain. Like, say you got, when we had the semiconductor interruptions in COVID, right? That like amplified itself through the economy, eventually hitting cars. Yeah. Given the trends that Jesse's talking about, how do we count the potential economic effects of a disruption on the 60% of jobs that are installers? Right.
Yeah, like I said, if China just blockades the panels, we go to war with China and they say no more panels to you, those 2/3 of jobs are now frozen too. Right. Like you can't install. So maybe we should have a solar panel strategic, pile. Just start buying tons of super cheap Chinese panels and just stick them in a giant, it's cheaper than the subsidy we're paying right now. But that's a serious thought. We have strategic oil reserves and other things. Why not have a strategic solar panel reserve, whatever, or minerals? There's another weird idea of if we just started importing Chinese EVs. Well, there's minerals in those EV batteries. Something to think about. I'm just saying, why go mine it? Just take it out of the car and recycle it. Anyway, we need to learn how to recycle it anyway. There's a serious thing there. Anyway, I'd love to do a study on the flows of that. Is it enough?
Overcapacity, recycling capacity.
There you go. Okay, well, let's bring those Chinese EVs. But yeah, so the battery one I think is a little more is different because it's totally different from solar. Solar has one application really, and I don't even think that was ever intended to be the application. The history of solar is so weird. It was we just for satellites, and then it went into our little Japanese calculators, and it was never for grid power. That was a crazy idea. I think if you had proposed that in the 70s. Anyway, except Carter thought it was a good idea. So. But batteries is different. I think there's a lot of other co-benefits for having battery capacity here, not just trying to be globally competitive, but there's also, almost every major battery chemistry that took off, like lithium ion, was invented here. It was created here. Our labs are doing the research right now. The next generation batteries, I would still bet, is likely to come out of a lab in the United States if we continue to fund science. That we would likely have breakthroughs. And then where do you go to commercialize this? I think this is the story of lithium ion batteries it was made freely available. Here's the IP, go. And entrepreneurs tried to go out and make it here, but they couldn't get funding. They couldn't put a factory together. There wasn't the industrial capacity to scale it up. And so they went to China. A123 was an American company that went to China to scale up because that's where they got investment and they had the labor force, they had everything they needed to do it. So, okay, if we rebuild some of that capacity, well, then maybe there's an opportunity for the next generation to come along. And this ties in with some of the DOE loan programs, the ability to have a pilot scale project that you get a great favorable loan from the Department of Energy for. Those kinds of things are longer term. This is not just making a small investment to, get EVs going today. This is decadal level thinking of, are you going to control the future of this? So solar, I think, at least in current paradigm, in monocrystalline, situation, we're not going to be at the frontier. I don't think we have any real hope of being there. But for batteries, there's so much innovation happening. There's new chemistries coming online. There's a lot of benefit that we're going to get longer term from this if we keep it alive, right?
One of the things we think about sort of project selection in the industrial policy space, solar is also interesting because people don't really make a lot of money making solar panels.
It's a terrible business.
And so when you think about the sort of the larger scale goals of industrial policy, which is like increasing productivity and like whether or not you're globally competitive, it's like it's not even sure you want to necessarily compete in that space. Like if China wants to subsidize global decarbonization, I fail to see some of that problem. But how do does that, I don't know how that relates to EVs actually. Like are Chinese EV companies making a lot of money, or is fierce competition in the internal market mean they're also like a 2% return prospect?
I mean, low margins, no doubt. I mean, margins are low, but some are profitable. I mean, BYD actually seems to be profitable. So there are some, but it's certainly low. Traditional wisdom in automotive is, the low end cars are just, there to get people in the door, but you want to sell them like a truck. You want to sell them a big hulking SUV. That's where there's bigger margin. Or you want to sell them a luxury model, a higher level trim. That's where the profits are. So this one SUV model, the higher level, luxury model, that's what keeps the business alive. The low end one are just selling at cost. And so BYD is kind of competing down there, and they're kind of like the Toyota of EVs. So their margins are thin. But that's actually kind of what we need. I mean, like, the majority of cars are old, used clunkers driving around this country, and that's what most people can afford in America with median incomes that have like 75 grand. I mean, I'm not buying a Tesla Model Y. We need the low. It's okay if you're making low margins if you're able to find another way. BYD, by the way, another important point is that's not the only thing they make. They're a super diversified company, so they're financially like pretty okay. They have a lot of different things going on.
Up and down the
Yeah. I mean, down to the windshield wiper on the car is made by BYD. I mean, they make everything. So they're a different animal compared to a lot of other companies, but they have to, like, most of automotive has something of a portfolio, and they try to have higher level trims that keep them afloat, but you have to kind of get into them. And in the US, the EV approach has basically been, we're going to make the higher end cars kind of only, like every EV is still kind of a high end car. We have the Leaf, we have like the Bolt maybe coming out soon, a refresh, and they're still sort of on the lower end, but they're still pretty expensive compared to like a used gas car. So this is what I was talking about. Like, it may not be so painful to bring over like the BYD Seal, like a really cheap car.
Is it fair to compare them to a used car? I mean, a used Bolt is pretty cheap.
But there's not a lot of them.
The new ones in the market, so that they trickle down. There's starting to happen.
The life cycle is so slow. It takes forever.
The turnover is
average age of a car in America is like 17 years. I mean, it's. So these things take a long time. So used EVs are great. I drive a $5,000 Nissan Leaf that I bought on Facebook. Okay, so it goes 60 miles. That's all I need. But I have different preferences.
It's like a go-kart.
It is. It's a nice go-kart. You can buy 7 of them for the price of like a Model Y. But there's not that many, right? And the hardest challenge was I had to find one that was close enough to my house because I couldn't drive it home and didn't have enough range. It's really sad. Anyway, but there's a long term to getting things, a long leeway to getting into a used market. We need to be thinking about turning over the fleet. I think this is a different perspective. How do you turn over the whole fleet of cars? Programs like these Cash for Clunkers programs, where you come in and give in your old clunker to go buy a used EV or something, are programs that might accelerate some of this. I don't know, economists don't like them because they say, well, that would just happen anyway, whatever. I think there's air quality benefits. We're getting into details that we don't need to get into here, but it's going to take a long time,
So I want to drill in on the institutional capacity question, state capacity, institutions, coordination, and I think you highlighted the NEVI EV grants program, which I do think is probably the greatest embarrassment of the last of the infrastructure funding. Here's a law passed in August of 2021. And by January of 2025, we've got a tiny fraction of the funds deployed. Right. Hubs, I think similar, although I do think there's a bit of you can point to the fact that there was a prolonged debate about the subsidy for clean hydrogen that I think delayed a lot of FID on the hubs as well.
Who could have instigated that, Jesse?
I have nothing to do with it. But the institutional question I think is really important, and I think one that we have not seen a whole lot of policymaker attention to. discussions around permitting reform, as you know, have been bubbling around, but they tend to be pretty narrow, right? Like let's make some revisions to NEPA or some of these, cornerstone policies.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of institutional innovation going on there to say, what does this process need to look like? How would I design an institution that can accomplish that goal?
Right.
Removing barriers is one thing. That's smart, where it makes sense, good, do that. But that's not coordination. That's not institutional innovation.
Yes.
So I'm curious, for each of you, particularly Frank, with your insights from the CHIPS Act, which was trying to do something very new, but also as you reflect on some of the failures and successes of the IRA and infrastructure law, what types of creative innovations do we think we need in terms of institutional design to try to more ably implement these policies in the future? Because that feels like a huge blind spot that we had in the legislation last time.
Yeah, and thank you. I'm actually not sure. That's part of what I'm arguing. We need to go and structurally interview Frank and a bunch of other people who've been trying to do this stuff to get a sense of what the needs are. But I have a sort of intuitive answer for you. Permitting reform is not institutional reform. Right. It's unwinding degenerate institutional dynamics, but it's not creating something that's going to operate differently. And if you do it wrong, you're sort of just replacing one bad thing with another. My thinking, or my hypothesis, would be that we've built institutions that are highly procedural, right? So if you look at the Hydrogen Hubs program as an example, it took the Department of Energy 6 months to even design what they wanted out of the timeline of implementation. And then they had to go talk to a bunch of people for a year and a half to see what might be possible in the first wave of applications. That is, and to do that, they set up a really picky, large infrastructure of needs, not bad things, like you need to demonstrate community benefits, you need to have a guidance council, you need to have a whole bunch of bells and whistles, all to deal with what I perceive as potential critiques or failure states of that policy.
Right. Very risk averse.
And sort of buries the risk aversion in procedure. Right. So it's always somebody else's fault, right? They didn't respond to the RFI in time, something like that. Yeah. Successful examples of industrial policy in the past, imperfect though it may be, the Manhattan Project is a good example, lots of individual human discernment. Right? An accountable leadership team that was given resources and tools, asked to perform something, given a timeline at which to do it, and then they were largely left alone. Then the products were taken and completely outside of their hands, imperfect as I said. But that is not the style of intervention that we do in the United States anymore, and I think a return to that style would be profoundly helpful. It carries risks of corruption, of mistakes, of patronage, so we need to find something that is in between the two extremes that we now experience. But what we have now, it's completely untenable, in my view, that we're going to achieve these goals with the system we have.
Yeah, and one of the things we have to try to balance, right, is there's the potential risks of inappropriate action, but there's clearly costs to inaction as well, right? Especially when we're talking about strategic goals where we're trying to execute on public policy. Or if you don't achieve those goals, then the U.S. falls behind in critical strategic industries. We fall behind in decarbonization and addressing climate externalities, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that part has been lost with in much of the conversation. With a major focus is on what are the risks of something going wrong when we act, but there's a huge cost to not acting as well.
Yeah, sure. So, the reason why I focused on NEPA and the Davis-Bacon Act as being hurdles to our implementation is because it's very weird working in a program where part of my workflow, the terminus is POTUS. So it's the thing that you worked on then it needs his approval to do this thing. And that's really where executive waivers resided. We all knew what the problem was in terms of getting these deals actually signed and in a state where they can't really be mucked with by the next administration. There's legalese and terms for all these different things, right? But they're very important. The reason why NEPA and the Davis-Bacon Act executive waivers are easy to focus on is because they were really the issues. It's why to bring up the the Joe Rogan podcast, again, like it's sort of really interesting or funny. I don't really know how to describe it. Like listening to Trump's own recounting of his own catalyzing of the CHIPS Act, honestly. This was something that, we discovered by accident in June of 2023. I was at breakfast one morning. I was like, "Oh, is that Mike Pompeo? Like, this is like, I say hi. Like, what's going on?" And he saw that I was wearing my CHIPS program office pin, which I'm not wearing today. But he was like, "Oh, you work in CHIPS? Like, you got to meet my former undersecretary Keith Kroc, who was the guy that had negotiated, the TSMC arriving and breaking ground in Arizona and those sorts of activities where, Trump's thought was that if you got these companies to start building in America, Samsung, TSMC, even Intel, this could make a really strong statement for the actual bills to pass to actually have the money to give you what you want, to give you the subsidy that you're getting everywhere else on this planet. To the point about basically just kind of like mimicking other advanced nations' industrial policy with our own. Our subsidy really was just matching what happens in Singapore, Korea, Japan, like whatever.
Right.
So, the statement there was, Keith had gone over and met with the chairman of TSMC and the CEO of TSMC and said, like, okay, how much does this thing cost? $10 billion? Great. You need how much? 3? Okay, cool, done. And like over the course of like a weekend, this was done. And so, when we showed up with a fleet of lawyers and thousands and thousands of pages of paperwork, they were very confused at TSMC and Samsung and elsewhere as to like, well, I don't get it. Like, you just told us we could have the money. We actually have to work for it now. And I bring that up because it's fascinating. If you think about a company like Apple, which is 25% of TSMC's revenue, there's no formal agreement of supply between them and their largest customer. And so what an amazing leap of faith that TSMC is making every time they break ground, because they don't know that their largest customer is actually going to show up and buy whatever it is that they're selling them. And this sort of lack of a legal agreement did not compute, with the policy makers that I worked with, because like, no, they said they're going to do it. They have to do it. It's like, let me tell you a reason why they should probably not agree to do it. And that is because, a business that's now a bit of a household name, NVIDIA, around the same time in 2023, did something I've never seen in my career. Like, they physically make a product and they guided revenue to grow 50% sequentially, which is like an incremental $4 billion worth of product they shipped just like overnight. And what's interesting about that is that TSMC is the bottleneck. And they are still, 2 years later, still the bottleneck. Like, demand looks like this, supply looks like that. There's still a wide gap. And if TSMC at any point in time had agreed to be giving away 25% of their capacity or more in perpetuity to Apple, they wouldn't be able to service these things that we can't predict in terms of the future. And like, how I know you can't predict them is because what's actually constraining TSMC's supply is the cheapest type of supply they could be providing. It's like back-end packaging. So it's really hard to predict the future. And, I think there was like a lack of agency for us as practitioners to be able to say, like, for us to get the support to say, like, this is our problem, we've identified it, this is how we get to the solution, just let us do it.
All right, I think we're going to open things up to the audience for a few questions before we run out of time here. We have another mic we can send around, or? Yeah, great. Let's go here first. Yeah, and this end. Yeah.
I can also yell loudly. I'm a teacher. Good afternoon. Between the challenges of having enough EV chargers and the average battery lifetime of an EV vehicle being about 10 years and some of the poor quality ones being as short as 5 years, At what point do we start making plans for recycling both of PVs and EV batteries? And should that be a part of our industrial policy from the get-go? Not just how do we get these vehicles and panels, but also what do we do with them when they're no longer functional?
So on the battery side, it is a part of the industrial policy. So both the infrastructure law, which provided grants for recycling, and the 45X subsidy and demand pull subsidy for the EV tax credit envision supporting recycling in North America or the United States in the case of 45X. So we are seeing companies like Redwood Materials and others developing novel technologies for recycling batteries, establishing capacity to do that. In fact, looks like capacity projections are exceeding the pace at which the vehicle batteries are going to be coming, out of the vehicles. Many of which are actually lasting a lot longer than anticipated at this point for the current generation of batteries. So for batteries, that's been the case. For PV, not so much that I see anyway. And the materials are less valuable to recover, but the waste challenge is substantial, and we don't have much of a plan for that, I guess.
And in terms of developing a strategy, you just have a volume problem right now, right? 10% of EV sales was only reached, last year?
Right.
And so when you think about building enough of a supply chain for that to be 60 or 80% of new vehicle sales, and a large proportion of that coming from, you just have to take the integral, right? It's going to take us a couple decades to get enough lithium out, or battery materials writ large, out into the economy for recycling to be a significant source category.
Thank you.
Here, and then let's get another mic over.
My question is addressed to Professor Helveston. In your last slide about the gas cars, that's the culprit. Now, but I like to frame it in a different way. One of the things in the Chinese EV is not just cheap, but they're all the mom and pop stores, they can make EV compete. There are many stores, although many of them will not survive. So the question is, why such a culture we do not find in America? Why the venture capitalists cannot fund mom and pop EV companies to compete with Tesla?
I'm not sure what you mean by. Do you mean mom and pop like vendors, like dealers, or are we talking about smaller automakers that can make EVs? I mean, the ecosystems, I think, the span in China it goes much lower than here. Like the smallest cars we have are like maybe a Leaf. But in China, you have like lots of these neighborhood vehicles. You also have tens of millions of two-wheeled electric vehicles. I mean, the electric mobility has been around in China for decades, and cars are just like the upper end of it. So I look at the perspective a little bit differently. The other thing is also just scale. Like there are provinces in China that are larger than like the whole East Coast in population. So you have a lot more demand for cars of a lot of different varieties. And again, these smaller cars that are maybe less technologically sophisticated are easier to put together by assemblers who don't have as much, maybe skill as like BYD. So I think there's just a lot more heterogeneity in the market. And there's also different standards on the roads. Like those cars are not safe to drive necessarily, but we have really high standards. It's hard to get a car that passes here. So a lot of the Chinese automakers would not even be able to be imported, tariff or not, just because they maybe don't meet our standards. Yeah, that's kind of my answer. I think it's just a very different market.
I'm sorry, I think I missed it. You are saying that we really have no need of EV with the American situation because all the other factors considered.
No. I'm just saying that, like the question about why don't we have smaller shops or smaller automakers maybe that make different products. I think the domestic market in China is much larger and more diversified, that those automakers can survive there, that they probably would not survive here. They would not be able to sell enough to make enough money to stay alive. That's
just a combination of regulatory standards that are much higher and just lack of.
And I think that's true for gas too.
Yeah,
like, I don't even think that's an EV issue. I think it's just more about diversified market there.
I mean, there's significant regulatory capture in the U.S. automotive
That's
industry.
Also that true. I mean, the CAFE standards are basically set by the automakers.
There are rules around who can sell a new car. And, they have. We don't have. There is like a kind of free market case for EV transition, which is rarely made, but you've been sort of implicitly making it around.
That's worth pointing out that there is a lot more direct-to-customer selling in China as well. You don't have to go through dealerships over there. NIO, XPeng, a lot of these companies, you buy an EV by just going to the website and saying buy it, and it just shows up.
Yeah, showroom in the mall, right?
Right. It's a very different model from here. We do have the dealership as a major stakeholder or broker, really, in the middle, who, for a lot of logical reasons, maybe don't want to have an EV transition. So that's another big hurdle here.
Right. Good. Here, time for maybe 2 more questions. Yep, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Ria Yi. I'm a third-year PhD student at Princeton Politics. And building on John and Franklin's points about coordination challenges, I think a key feature of new industrial policy is the use of diverse tools across different stages of the value chain. So I wonder, to what extent do the policymakers consider policy complementarity at the aggregate value chain level, that kind of by complementarity, I mean mitigating the negative spillovers and unintended welfare costs. For example, when you impose a subsidy at the upstream producers, you think about the price effect for the downstream producers, both domestically and internationally. And if they do think about it, how do they approach this?
I don't know how much they do think about it. I think that was kind of the point that I was raising, is I think we need to think more about those kinds of things. Like the interconnections between these things are the parts that we often omit, and we make a policy decision not thinking about the either downstream effect on our own supply chain or the global effect, like what happens to our partner abroad or the market abroad that we're now going to lose because of this, or so anyway, that's a different level of state capacity that we need. I mean, maybe there's one silver lining from the complete gutting of our entire civil service.
So we have to rebuild now.
We have to rebuild it next time. I don't know. It's pretty horrific right now, but maybe 2 years from now we can learn from this and write some things down and say, okay, next time we're going to build it this way. It's horrific, by the way. I don't like what's happening if it's not clear. But yeah, there's the need for reform, I think, is unquestionable, sure, but there are legal ways to do that, and just breaking the laws blatantly and ignoring courts is not really a great idea.
Uniform firing anybody who's been hired in the last 2 years.
Yeah, some of those things are pretty not great. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, how I would go about answering that question is, it's not lost on anybody, I don't think, that if you're going to have a manufacturing mega cluster like what TSMC dreams of doing in Arizona, Intel throughout the United States, all these other things, it is not just those enterprises that make that happen. There's this whole downstream supply chain element of it that is really a miracle within Taiwan and other parts of Southeast Asia that, in theory, we had tools to try to incentivize and bring to the U.S. I can remember being in Singapore in November of 2023, trying to win some hearts and minds and encourage these supply chain, the not even really small mom and pop type supply chain companies to come to America to follow TSMC and others. And I remember this one executive was like, "Do I need to hire a lawyer?" I'm like, yeah, you need to hire a lawyer. I'm sorry, I don't know what to say, because our process was so not designed to be commercial or friendly. So that the only companies that could actually engage are the ones that could spend tens of millions of dollars filling out our applications and interfacing with our lawyers and our consultants and answering our questions. So I don't know if they'll get to the work of the supply chain stuff. Actually, yeah, I know a bit about that. It's happening right now. And I don't know if they'll be successful doing it or not, because the process was too onerous, honestly.
You pass the mic right behind you there with the last question there.
Thanks. Emil Demenchev. I work with Jesse. My question is, hypothetically, if you could keep some small subset of the IRA, what subset would you advocate for? Thank you.
Isn't that what we're doing voting right now?
Yeah, no.
I think that's down to 2 people right now in the White House who are going to decide that. But
Yeah. But what would you tell them? What would you tell Vice President Elon Musk?
let's keep the battery stuff. Okay. I mean, both of those pieces are, I think, really important and critical.
Including the EV deployment subsidy?
Yes, I think both. I think that's just again, there are bigger, longer term benefits from this. It's not. It's a very different situation from solar, and so yeah, we need to keep those. We need to keep the consumer subsidies. If we're gonna, I mean, I would also presume that this would involve we also are gonna let things go, because that's probably what's gonna happen. And I feel like if we did lose the solar one, I don't feel like that would be as painful as some of these other ones. You might be able to convince me that it's still worth it, but if we lost it, I wouldn't cry too much as I would for EVs. That would be pretty bad. What else, though? There's so many things.
LPO?
Yeah. Anyway, anybody else? I mean,
Yeah.
I have a lot of thoughts on that question. I do think keeping some of the manufacturing tax credits is totally worthwhile. I agree that you can't just force that on the supply side, so some reform of the consumer tax credits for EVs seems warranted. Actually getting the charging thing right on EVs is like of paramount importance. And if I were talking to a Republican who wanted to stay somewhat good on climate but cut the federal budget, like shifting the relative burden of policy toward charging as opposed to consumer purchases is like, universities publish why that's a good idea. This isn't even that's totally a rational thing to do. Wind and solar, Jesse and I argue about this in group chats all the time. We could probably relieve those. Certainly change the way they're deployed in areas of high curtailment already. I think keeping grid batteries and nuclear support for the power sector are both hyper important. And I do actually like the energy efficiency stuff for consumers. We are dramatically.
Please keep the heat pumps.
I don't. That's a cultural item, right?
It's not.
We need better heat pump.
But energy efficiency is like a really good investment for the public to make.
Yeah, I'll agree on most of that. I would say investment tax credit better than production tax credit for clean electricity. It also happens to be the one that supports nuclear, geothermal, and energy storage, which are probably more likely to be politically salient right now.
Well, also just highly
it,
valuable to the problems we face.
Well, yeah, I mean, it solves the curtailment issue in the sense that it doesn't encourage production for the sake of production.
Right.
It also happens to have the benefit of scaling down as the technology cost declines, and if your goal is to drive cost innovation, that's good, whereas the PTC is a constant per dollar subsidy. On the debate on the EV deployment subsidies, I mean, yes, it'd be nice to do more on chargers. I don't think those are substitutes. I think those are complements at this point in the transition. And if you're trying to link that to the domestic competitiveness objectives, then rather than scrapping 30D, which is the personal clean vehicle subsidy that has all these sourcing rules in it, extend those sourcing rules to the commercial EV tax credit, 45W, which would then pull in the other half of the market or third of it that's now leases. Which avoid all those sourcing rules at the moment. So that's my 2 cents. All right, I think we are out of time. There's some chance to chat more about over lunch. Please join me in thanking our panel.